What's up, everyone? Today I have a special treat for you guys. Joining us today is Shimmy. As it turns out, Shimmy and I are both big fans of Erich Neumann, the depth psychologist you probably are all familiar with, who made massive contribution to Carl Jung's original work. Hey, Shimmy, thanks for joining us, and thanks for joining me on the channel.
Sure. Hello. Thank you so much for having me, Thipan.
Yeah, awesome. Now we came to Neumann in, I guess, kind of fairly different contexts. For you, Neumann is someone who enriched your understanding of your own faith and your own culture. And I was wondering if you could describe what Neumann and Neumann's writing sort of did to sort of enrich your understanding of your own background.
Sure. First of all, I'll say that the first book that I read by Erich Neumann was The Origin and History of Consciousness. As much of it as as anybody could try to understand. More the mythological part than the book is split up into two, which is the mythological part, and then there's also the more tipuli, as we say in Hebrew, or the more therapeutic part, where it goes into the individual and the therapeutic process that they go through. But I read less of that, but the first part I definitely read. And already that had a very large impact on me and definitely shaped the way that I see the world. And then after that, I discovered that Erich Neumann had written. It was originally a 3-part book, but the 2 parts that have been published of it, it's been published in 2 parts, which is called The Origins of Jewish Consciousness. And that book, I just remember reading it's split into 2. The first one talks about revelation, and it's more biblically focused. And then the second part of it talks about Hasidism, which is a esoteric, you could say esoteric movement. It's kind of, for those who are familiar with Sufism, it's kind of like the Jewish Sufism, but it more developed in the 18th century with the Baal Shem Tov, as we call him. And then it holds enormous significance and has enormous following in Judaism today. In terms of how that affected me, I'll just give a little bit background on myself because it's imperative to know for this context. I grew up Orthodox, which means I grew up following the commandments, both the oral Torah, both the written Torah, which is the 5 books of Moses, and also the oral Torah, which is the Talmud and the Mishnah, which are rabbinic. It's the Torah Shebaal Peh is oral law, which was given by Moses according to tradition, and then it was expounded upon and eventually written down. It used to get passed from mouth to mouth, as we say, orally, and then eventually it got written down, and that is called the halakha, or the way. It's kind of like the Sunni, sorry, not the Sunni, the Hadith. Like you have the Quran for Muslims, and then you have the Hadith, right? So you have the Quran, which is the written text, and then you have the sayings of the Prophet. And those also inform certain ways that somebody acts within their life. And growing up Orthodox, I was the father. My father's a rabbi, so I did have a good information, and I was well informed with texts. And text study has always been a big part of my life. And then, as many people go through questioning periods of their lives, I started becoming less observant. I took off my kippah, which is the ritual head covering. I didn't keep commandments necessarily. I didn't keep the Sabbath. And during this kind of very turbulent period, I found Erich Neumann. And what's amazing, and this is a direct continuation of Jung, is the way that he brings together mythology and psychology. But then there's a whole nother with Erich Neumann in the history of Jewish consciousness, the origins of Jewish consciousness. He also brings in a certain amount of biblical criticism, and he's able to bring the text to light in a psychological manner. That's just a little bit about what I read there. I can expand on that if you like. Should I go on?
You could. That's really interesting. Like, it sounds like these works kind of, in a sense, rejuvenated your faith and kind of brought it back into focus and sort of gave you a reason to kind of, or at least give you a deeper understanding of what was really going on within your faith.
Well, I'll say this. I got into Jung mainly through Jordan Peterson, as many other people, And Peterson says about Jung that he had a frightening ability to look at historical processes. And Neumann got that from him. I mean, Neumann was one of his closest students, and Neumann's ability to track and to create a narrative of what was going on with the Jewish people inside of this book is absolutely phenomenal and eye-opening for me. So, I mean, maybe I'll just give a little bit. I'll give a little bit of a summary of what the book talks about, or at least what the first half of the book is.
Yeah, please do.
Okay, so again, so we have the general Jungian Neumannian concept, which is that the development of the individual psychologically mimics, or the development of the world goes through stages that are similar to the psychological development of the individual, which we understand through the hero story, right? Which is, so we usually have the 4 different stages, which is the Ouroboros, the beginning of the ego wresting itself from the Ouroboros, the fight with which is the separation of the world parents, the fight with the dragon, and then the transformation. So if in the Jungian terms you have world and then you have man, in a very Jewish context, Neumann brings in the Am, which means the people or the nation. And he sees that there is a connection between what's going on with the world. At what stage do we know that the world is in developmentally? Well, we can take a look at Am Yisrael. We can take a look at the people of Israel. We can see what's going on there. And we can understand what stage of psychological development are we in the hero story or in the psychological development. Am I being clear? I think that's a good summary.
That's great. Yeah, because you've touched on like a lot of the things that I try to emphasize in my video. So I mean, I'd like to know a lot more about like sort of what Erich Neumann explains in these books and sort of how it relates.
Yeah. So for instance, we said that the people of Israel is a reflection. It kind of stands on the level between the development of the individual and the development of the world. So there's also the development of the nation. And we could see what the world is going through, which stage it's at, depending on what the people of Israel are going through at that time. So the people of Israel, so let's start, where did the people of Israel actually sprout from? So if we look at the Middle East and we look around Canaan, which in the Bible is where the land of Israel is called Canaan, then Erich Neumann says that most of the cults there are mother cults, right? They serve the mother goddess, and most of the cults and the rituals that are done there are generally revolve around emasculation. It's orgiastic cults, and worshiping cults of the renewal of nature. Mm-hmm. And there is Baal, for instance, but there's always Asherah as well. There's also very heavily orgiastic and feminine ritual and rites, which, if that goes off in our head, so what do we understand there? That is, we're in the Ouroboros stage. It's that the consciousness is continually being swallowed up and, reimbursed within nature. And he sees that the development of Yahweh, or Yud He Vav He, YHVH, which is the God of Israel, as being a masculine identity. And the fact that it's a masculine identity, he understands that as the beginning of humanity, or the beginning of the Israeli people, and eventually what they will bring to humanity, as which, by the way, is culmination in Jesus. I personally think is identification with the Father, which is, and therefore the ability to move out of the Ouroboros stage, right? Because in the individual development, right, if we were to say that a person is having, let's bring it to like an individual place. If somebody's continually being pulled, they have an addiction, right? So they're not in charge. It's the physical world is in charge of them, right? It has such a pull on them that they can't get out of it anymore. So, in Neumann and Jungian psychology, they need to be able to separate the worlds, right? They need to say, hey, this is wrong and this is right. And then once you do that, well, once you have wrong and right, well, then you can choose between them. And in order to do that, there needs to be, in Neumann psychology, there needs to be an identification with the Father, what's called, right? And the identification with the Father allows you to, after the separation, of course, there's a million stages here, but this is the general schema. So the development of Yahweh, of Yud He Vav He, becoming the patron god of the Israel people in a land which is filled with these matron cults, Neumann sees that as the beginning of the extrication of the ego from the overwhelming Ouroboros. And yeah, so that's one example.
No,
How you can see, yeah, and so wow, there's just so much to say. Yeah, maybe you can guide me, or you can ask another question.
That's the, I mean, that's incredible and super fascinating to me. Like, it's hard for me to even like say like how kind of like mind blowing that is, because it's not just, you know, these stages of consciousness. We can see them as like psychological things which happen to the individual, but like as you said, there are also things which happen to the world itself. Like, first of all, collective humanity is undergoing these stages perpetually, leading to sort of higher realms of consciousness. But it seems like, I mean, in a very real sense, like our modern culture and, you know, the fact that like the Western world is mostly, you know, a Judeo-Christian oriented sort of view of the world, it is the continuation of those early stages of consciousness where, you know, we began with this kind of, you know, this matriarchal society, and then sort of began to move towards a more patriarchal society, where the sort of law of the father reigned. And so, like, I mean, it's like, as you said, it's not just these psychological facts, it's also these historical facts. Like, this shaped the course of history. We are the continuation of this process, which spans back, what, like 10,000 years, if we go, you know, really far back. I did have a question, though, because you did mention sort of the archaeological evidence sort of conflicting with Neumann's sort of, because again, Neumann was mostly a psychologist. So he was looking at everything through a psychological lens. Are there any sort of disparities between the model which Neumann gives and the historical evidence as you've seen it?
Not as I've seen it. I haven't looked too deeply into it. I will say that he was working Neumann's mythology and Jung's mythology, and their primitive psychology in general is based off of what was it, Levi Bruhl, one.
Yeah, Levi Bruhl. Yeah, was a big one.
There's another one in there as well. Well, let's actually just say a word. I mean, just because we're living in a world of where there's a lot of postmodern critique and post-structuralist critique. I mean, these theories are like a nightmare for, or they can seem like a nightmare until you actually explain them the whole entire way through. Whether for postmodern critique, feminist critique. I mean, it just seems so heavily patriarchal that, you know, the patriarchal development of the consciousness is necessary for us to leave this primitive matriarchal society. By the way, it was what's amazing about Jungian and Neumann psychology is that there needs to be a transformation at the end, which is a return to the feminine.
Yeah.
And if there's not, then it's disastrous. Which, by the way, I think is the story of our time. And yeah, I mean, I don't really like. I've read some critique of Neumann. Most of it being postmodern stuff, which is, well, that's just your narrative, and that's a narrative that you live within. But if we allow ourselves to be narrative based, then I personally, you know, I haven't read anything that discusses the historical or mythological. I think I mean, obviously, because I love Neumann and I love Jung, I think that the way that they read mythology and were able to see that in the development of the individual is, I won't say flawless, but I will say that it's incredibly elegant.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think, I mean, one disparity that I would mention, this is just based off what, you know, I delve into history a lot because, I don't know, for some reason I just have this obsession with history where I just spend a lot of time researching history. To an unhealthy degree, I would say. But what I've seen, and this could be a critique of Neumann, and the thing is, I understand sort of why this sort of potential error, because the thing is, I'm not, you know, history is very long, and so a lot of things could have happened in history that we aren't familiar with, or that like I'm personally not familiar with. But one critique I would say of Neumann is that I wouldn't classify religion itself, and I'd like to hear your thoughts on this, as something which transitions from matriarchal to patriarchal. It seems that humans at first kind of exist in a matriarchal state, and then it's something like religion. And I see religion, like there is evidence of like a kind of matriarchal society that existed in the Middle East, very early on, but it's kind of hazy, and it's not clear if it was a religion or if it was just like a couple of statues of these very feminine figures. But in my view, and it's just based on, and this is me trying to enrich sort of Neumann's perspective, is that religion itself seems to be a kind of patriarchal institution by nature, because what a religion implies is a kind of separation from nature. You're no longer in the realm of instincts, no longer in the realm of maternal instincts. We classify it as maternal because you don't have to do anything; they just kind of follow your body. But what religion is kind of a stepping away from instinct and a kind of sort of abiding by higher divine principles.
Yes.
And those divine principles I see as having, in a very real psychobiological sense, having more to do with the father than with the mother. Because in the mother you can be passive, you don't have to abide by anything.
Right.
But the father is the authority which imposes upon you and requests that you act differently than just according to your own nature. And so that's why I think the error in Neumann's thinking is that he kind of interpreted it as first a feminine religion and then a masculine religion, whereas I see it as the sort of feminine aspect of a religion. So we talk about like an early religion like the Greeks. We'll just go with the Greeks for now because I can't think of any other examples off the top of my head. But in Greek mythology, we have like the mother goddess Gaia, who is separated from the sky goddess, sky god. What's his name? Uranus?
Zeus?
Uranus? Well, not Zeus
Uranus?
yet. Yeah, or I can't remember his name, but it got essentially the sky father, right? And I think that this feminine sort of this feminine side it becomes illuminated by the fact that masculine religion becomes a thing. So like the reason I'm not sure if I'm totally clear, but what I'm trying to say is essentially when we examine the feminine in psychology, it's in the context of it being the opposite of masculinity. It's not necessarily that like femininity is first the thing and then we transition into masculinity. It's more like the feminine becomes apparent when we start to remove ourselves from our instincts. We realize like there was a kind of instinctual side to our nature, and then we classified it as feminine, and that appears in our mythologies and our systems of belief. That is kind of how I see it, and that's my
I'll say that first of all, I think it's important to make a distinction between ritual and cult and religion. As in, what I mean to say, let's see if I can formulate this, is that depending in the Jungian psychology, depending on where we can understand where the collective consciousness is, depending on the way that we play it out in ritual inside of the world, right? Because the world is kind of the material playground for the projections of our conscious, right? So you have the rites and the cults, you have the feminine maternal, matriarchal cults in the beginning that eventually turn into the patriarchal cults. Now and you can call them religion or you can call them cult. Now the nature of the matriarchal cult is the cult of instinct, whereas the nature of the patriarchal cult, which eventually becomes of what we call today religion, is a separation of light and dark. It's binary. It's zeros and ones. It's how do we build? Which in general, I mean, if we allow ourselves to live with, if we allow ourselves a second to put on archetypal glasses, is that the men generally are the one that say, okay, how do we build this building now? We need to have tractor, and we need to have, we need to make schedules, and we need to put things inside of time. None of those things which exist within the instinctual world. Whereas in the more feminine archetype, it's more like, well, I go with the flow, right? And it's more emotional, it's more instinctual. And I'll say, and this is important for understanding the origins of Judaism, of Jewish consciousness, is that Neumann doesn't use the word Judaism. He often uses the word Judah-ism, and that is the religion of Israel that develops when they're exiled from their land. Now, being exiled from your land, in general, he would always say that, well, the land, you can have this very masculine identity, but you always have a land principle, which is balancing between the two. But then just I'll give a little bit of Jewish history, is that the people, there's two temples. The first temple is destroyed in 586 BC by the Babylonians, by Nebuchadnezzar, and then it's also destroyed in 70 by Titus and the Romans. And then in 70, there hasn't been Jewish sovereignty inside of the land of Israel until 1948, to the modern state of Israel today. And that the necessity, once you're moved outside of your land, well, the land is the feminine archetype in its, heavens and land, sun and moon, right? So the land is the feminine archetype. As long as you have that, then there's a healthy balance between the cult, which is towards the, you have the two balancing principles. And inside of the Jewish culture itself, the exile is a state of sickness. We say it's a state of sickness. Why? Because we don't have that balance. And what kept Judaism intact throughout the exile was what we call the halakha, and which is the law of the rabbis. Now, the law of the rabbis, and today you see a lot of, especially in Jewish feminist critique, there's a lot of critique on the Jewish religion as being very paternal, which it is. Currently, it's very patriarchal. Well, that's because we've been in a necessary patriarchal system for 2,000 years. And why is that? Because if you don't have the governing mother principle, which is the land, the only thing that you can live within at that point, and there's a Jewish saying, which is that since we've been exiled, we only have the 4 cubits, which is a measurement of the halakha, of the law. And that's how a person lives. They live within this kind of, they live within the words. They live within words, they live within laws. That was our land. Our land was laws and our land was words. And that was the Judah-ism that Erich Neumann talks about. Eventually, and again, this is a good example of how Erich Neumann saw the historical processes happening to the Jewish people as being a harbinger for the universal psychological stage that the world is in, is that we return to the land of Israel. So the return of the land to Israel is the descent back into feminism, into the feminine for the Jewish people. And also, and I mean, if we take a look, Jung's obsession with Sophia, or Jung's obsession with, Jung believed that we were at the turn of a century again, of one very similar to the one that happened as Christianity was sprouting out. And I also believe that we're at that turn. We're living in a hyper-conscious, right, hyper-masculine, hyper-conscious society where our technological capabilities are frightening, and we need a return to the subconscious. And the subconscious element is always identified with the feminine. And it's interesting because 2,500, 3,000 years ago, there was in order to strengthen consciousness, there was a necessity to get out of the subconscious realm. And Neumann talks about this. He says that a lot of the laws that a lot of the laws that are given over at Sinai, Mount Sinai is where the revelation of the Torah, or the law, is given down to the Jewish people, are centered around strengthening consciousness. Because as long as you're having these laws, and he describes at how the ancient rites and the ancient rituals were meant to pretty much be a melting pot for all the consciousnesses that were taking part, whether that's orgiastic rites, bloodletting, or getting drunk and using, or not prophesying, magic, all these things that are generally connected with the subconscious realm. Well, the Jewish religion wanted to strengthen and bring out of that, so that way we can move into the next stage. Well, all of a sudden we got to do another switch right now, and we got to go back, delve back into the subconscious. That's just a little bit of a rant of mine. Yeah, I don't know if any of that made sense though.
No, that perfect. That resonated very well with me. I wanted to ask about. I wanted to ask about that second part of that Neumann book, the Jewish origins of consciousness. Because
sure.
Yeah.
So the second part. I mean, the second part of if the first part is talking about how the people of Israel catechized the extrication of the ego, of the collective ego, from the maternal ego enveloping swamp of Ouroboros, of the terrible mother, then Hasidism, or the renewal of the Jewish esoteric tradition and the Kabbalah within Hasidism, which was the esoteric movement, is the beginning of the return to the feminine. To give an example, the greatest teacher and the founder of the Hasidic movement. The Hasidic movement began in Europe, 18th century, and the founder of it was the Baal Shem Tov, who was kind of, according to modern day studies, he was heavily influenced by the shamanic cultures and the healing culture going around in Galicia, in Ukraine, and Poland, and those areas of Europe at that time. And he was like a shaman healer Jew. And there's a story that he went up into the heavens, and when he went up to the heavens, he met with God, and he said to God, "When is the Messiah gonna come?" And God said, "When your teachings become very popular, the Messiah will come." So these teachings that the Hasidus revolves around, Neumann dedicated his whole entire book, much of the book. There's also just general explanation of what Hasidism is, but a lot of the book was showing how the feminine element is being revived within Hasidus. And that feminine element is always, Judaism is always very wary of it as long as they're in the exile. And that's because the feminine is supposed to come from the land itself. And when you have all these, now there's always the underground, Gershom Scholem, the famous Kabbalah researcher who really founded the modern research of Kabbalah, he wrote a very influential piece which talked about how the development of the law and communal life and the underground development of the esoteric tradition were always at tension with one another, because and there was Jewish history, I actually don't know if I want to go into the Shabtai Tzvi. That's like, it's not so connected, and I can go to a lot of different places with this. I will say, yeah. So the second half of the book is what Neumann saw as being the revival of the way that we now get into feminine principle again, which is more of a state of being. And one of the most foundational teachings of Hasidus is bringing a person to be in bittul, what we call, or the nullification of the self, and the ability to have pure being, and to bring oneself into the feminine, into a feminine mode of being in order to receive the Heavenly Father, we could say. And that requires a shift, as opposed to being in a masculine state of mind. Now we need to go into feminine state of being. And so, yeah, I mean, that's what a lot of the second part of the book deals with. And he goes and he shows how that sprouted from Hasidus, and what is the Hasidic, with the different Hasidic teachings, and how they bring us into a more feminine state of being.
Wow. That seems like then that sort of that reversal to the feminine, which occurred in Judaism, happened very late, like 18th century only.
Yeah. The world in general, I mean, is the way that I see it, and I think that Neumann and Jung, I mean, it takes a long time for these processes to happen. It's not just, well, in the year, Christ is born, and then all of a sudden, Jesus is born, and then all of a sudden, no, we're in the masculine era. No, it's things that are always taking form, and then all of a sudden it's transferred, just like in your own life.
Yeah.
Right? In your own life, it takes time for processes to happen. For people that are in addiction, they're, which is generally identified with the Ouroboros stage, which is they're in this cycle that they cannot get out of. The physicality and the material world keeps swallowing them up. They have no control over themselves. And then eventually, they start, is slowly, they start to have identification. They have a principle. They have light and they have darkness. They have a separation of the worlds. They understand what's good and what's bad. And then eventually, slowly, they start. And then after that, after they're very, very strict with themselves, they're able to, again, let loose. Right? So there's this kind of process where they go from instinct, which is totally controlling their lives. And then eventually, once they've, brought themselves to a state of consciousness, they can delve back in to a state of instinct again, but a state of instinct that is rectified. And that is what a lot of the Jewish esoteric teaching is about. It's the rectification of the world. It's the rectification of the self. And the rectification of the self is at a certain point in history and a certain point in the individual development of person is one of heavily conscious development, which is the identification with the father, the masculine principle. And then sometimes the rectification of a person is that, hey, you're over binary, you're over conscious, you're hyper conscious, you need to take a dip into the subconscious. And that's what Hasidism, and that's what that's what the Pirsum, how did you say? That's the publication of the esoteric works are coming to do, to give us a dip back into the subconscious, to bring us into this world, which is so necessary. And so that begins to sprout in the 18th, it begins to sprout in the 18th century. And the way that it's taken over Jewish world today is you can't imagine a world of Judaism today without, you can imagine it, but Judaism today is, it's just not the same thing without the Hasidic teachers, which have become enormously popular.
I wish this discussion could literally go on forever, because the number of questions that just come to my mind from you talking, I'm like, okay, wait, what about this?
Yeah, go ahead, shoot.
I'll just throw the one that I wrote down, which is, well, it's not really a question, but there's a point that you could probably elaborate on, which is more like, it seems like to me that we sort of, the reason we sort of engage in this masculinization of the human race is so that we get to a point where we don't need to, like, how do I explain it? Like, it's like you said before, like we return to the feminine, but because we worked so hard, I'll give it like a simple example. Like farming is sort of the earliest activity that humans did that wasn't instinctual, and in fact, it's very tied to religion. It seems as
whole Jewish religion. Yeah, the whole Jewish religion is founded. All the 2/3 of the laws are about working the land, and all of our holidays, except for the ones that happen in the exile, are connected to the calendar and connected towards the cycle of the fields of agriculture.
Ancient Egypt as well. Ancient Egypt itself is like an agricultural society, but it's a highly religious. Their entire worldview was their religion, and that was to facilitate agriculture. The flooding of the Nile, the fact that there needs to be a sense of periodicity, so that like we could do the same things every year, because that's not natural. People don't naturally do the same thing every year. Hunting patterns change, where plants grow changes, so you have to go with the seasons. But when you do something like agriculture, you need to be able to repeat it over and over again, and that of course requires this masculinization
ritual.
that we've been discussing. Yeah, ritual, exactly, that we've been discussing. But it seems like, and this seems like it's tied to Judaism in a lot of different ways, but especially in the ways that you discussed, that we worked this hard and we put in this extra effort so that we can dive back into the feminine and be more comfortable, because we can now kind of enjoy the fruits of our labors and we don't need to worry so much. That's kind of what the sort of diving back into instinct, at least one part of it, because I always see things from a psychological perspective. And in my sort of psychological worldview, this feminine side really is a part of your psyche that you need to sort of delve into whenever consciousness isn't doing it for you. That's a psychological perspective. In the more cultural perspective, it seems like, this might even be connected to the Sabbath, where after a week of work, you're allowed to, it's basically like you're allowed to chill now. And comes the reward, in a sense, of your labors, because and it's true of human society in general, because we work super hard to develop these technologies, these heated houses, electricity. We work super hard to do that, and then now we can enjoy it. And now there's a part of us that can relax, and that we don't need to, we don't need to constantly fight against our instincts. We can just enjoy the fruits of our labors. And it seems like that's kind of what that's connected to.
Right. So you said the Sabbath, so I have to pick up on that, which is so fundamental, because the Sabbath plays an enormous role in the Hasidic teachings. The Sabbath in general in Judaism is the holy day of the week. And in eschatological, I'll bring the Midrash, the Jewish Midrash. There is these Jewish, it's parables, stories, and different teachings of Judaism from the rabbis. And there is a Midrash that says 2,000 years there was chaos, 2,000 years there was Torah or law, and 2,000 years there is Messiah. And now 2,000 is 6,000. And then at the end of that 6,000 year stage, there is the redemption. Now, again, from a Jungian and Neumannian, chaos, Ouroboros, Torah, law, extrication of ego, consciousness, ability to leave that stage. And then there's the Messianic age, fight with the dragon, the instantiation of culture, the deification of man. And then after that, Sabbath. And Sabbath is, we say Sabbath the queen. We say Shabbat Hamalka. When the Sabbath comes in, we turn around in the synagogue and we bow down and we say, come Sabbath the queen, come Sabbath the queen, which every week repeats itself on the seventh day, but also in the eschatological sense, it happens in the beginning of the seventh, at the end of the 6,000 years. And so then you have the 7,000 year, right? And then you have the beginning of the 6,000 year, which is the, in the more eonic sense, is the age, the eon of the Sabbath, the eon of the feminine. And there's midrashim, there's teachings in Jewish tradition which talk about, well, in the coming times, in the times, the messianic times, and the times where we will, the world will be at peace again, it will be all Sabbath all the time. And what is Sabbath? Hint, hint, Sabbath is the queen. So what's it going to be? We're going to be in a feminine state all the time. I really want to talk about Jesus and Nietzsche, because I think that they are the two prophets that show the kind of how do you say, the moving upwards into consciousness.
Mm-hmm.
And then Nietzsche is the prophet who I think is on, call me a heretic, but I think his prophetic and messianic worth. And when I say the word Messiah, I mean the harbinging of a new eon. There's the character. I'll start by talking about the tzaddik, or the tzaddik is the righteous person. And to use a fancy Latin term that'll make me sound very smart, is the axis mundi, right? He is the axis upon which the world spins. And in Hasidism, you have a lot, and in Kabbalah in general, you have a lot of talk about, and you have it in the Torah as well. It says tzaddik yesod olam. The righteous person is the foundation of the world, right? Because we said that the righteous person is, and this is formative, this is the hero. Tzaddik, righteous person, hero. All lined up, that is A equals B equals A equals B, B equals C, A equals C, in Neumannian terms. That you have the righteous one, and he is the hero. And he is the Messiah. The Messiah is also the hero. He is the one who is able to already live within the next eon, and he's, next psychological era, and he's able to, he already lives within that, which is far above usually, far beyond the place he's living in than most people are. And he's able to bring that and instantiate that into the world. And then the world renews itself through the hero, through the righteous person, right? And so when I say the word Messiah, what I mean is somebody who harbinges in a new era of consciousness, or is the new God bringer, or is the new law bringer, or is the one, as we say in mythological context, we can use the story of Gilgamesh. He's the one who goes to foreign lands, goes down into the depths, and brings the herb of life. And the herb of life is renewal. And that's the righteous person is the one, or the Messiah is the one who brings renewal. And I think that's the way that messianism is also used in the Bible. The fact that there will be one Messiah at the end of times is I think it's a more apocalyptic understanding of the Messiah. But I see Jesus on the one hand being the harbinger for the era of consciousness, which eventually leads into, if we go personally, I think that Jesus was part of the Essene cult. I don't know how much you know about that. You say you read history. The Essenes were a cult that were living around first. I'm not going to go into it. I'm sorry. It would take too much to explain.
I'm curious, but
okay, we can have more discussion on that. But yeah, so Jesus and Nietzsche. Let's put it simply like this. There is already Jesus is the culmination and the harbinger of an era of consciousness. It happens right before the temple is destroyed and the Jewish people exile their land, which again, if we're putting on Neumannian glasses for a second, we're seeing that being as humankind disconnected, the people of Israel disconnect from their land, which means that, hint, hint, the rest of humanity and the world is going through a process of which we are leaving instinct, and we are going into much, secondary personalization is a term that's used. Now we're heavily identified with the Father, and that is, in my eyes, you have in Catholicism, man and Orthodox man to stay with Mother Mary, and it's very influential in Catholicism as I've understood. But in general, Jesus is what we're aiming at, and that's and Jesus worship is a very masculine type of worship. And if you look at the Desert Fathers, and you look at the whole entire monastic association, or the monastic life in Christianity, it's all about disconnecting from the instinct, disconnecting from the urges of the instinct, the urges of the body, and reaching ultimate state of consciousness, and where which culminates in identification with Jesus and identification with God. I want to show you my favorite saint. This is, perhaps you can recognize.
That Saint Mike?
That's Saint George.
Saint George, of course, yeah.
Yeah, Saint George is killing the dragon here. Probably like one of the most well-known saints in Christianity. Okay, so let's quickly give a little Jungian analysis to what's going on in this picture. Okay, so what do we have down here? Right, we have the dragon. Now the dragon is, on the personal level, not the transpersonal level, not the symbolic level, is generally identified with the body, and also the phallus. It's this long, scaly thing, and that needs to be conquered by the enlightened individual who is pinning it down with his spear, with the help. This one, I got one that is devoid of Christian motif just because of my faith, but there's plenty of icons that also have the helping hand of God, and Jesus is there in the background as well. And that is what humanity needs to do, and that's why and by the way, the killing of the dragon is, and of course this shows up all the time in Jungian and the Jungian psychology, the destruction of the dragon. That is what humankind's got to do right now. We cannot be pulled back into instinct. We are in a fight for our life between us and the subconscious. If we let the gates of hell, right, of Hades, which is always these, demonic, and it's often identified also with the feminine. If we let that overtake us, we're going to slip into hell. The world, will be taken over by Satan. And there's this very heavy dualism. We need to destroy, the serpent, and we need to overcome the world of instinct. Right. And so we did a freaking good job at that too. I mean, look where we are today. We do not live in the world of the dragon and the world of the snake. If we go according to the evolutionary biologist explanation of why the snake is so popular, is because it would eat us when we were monkeys, right? Well, we don't live in that world anymore, man. We beat the snake. We beat the dragon. I think, I personally think that. We beat the dragon. Okay, so what's coming next? Do we keep running after imaginary dragons? Because if we do, then what ends up happening there? Well, we're hyperconscious, we're disconnected from our instinct, and we become very, very sick. Jung always talked about how the sickness, what pushes a person back to connection with the subconscious, is sickness. And sickness often comes from a disconnection with the instinct, a disconnection from the body. Right? And you're far too inside your head. You're far too inside your fantasies, and you've forgotten your body. You're disconnected. You're disembodied. That's the way that a lot of us walk around.
Yeah, that's the premise of neurosis itself.
The premise of neurosis itself. Yeah. Can you expand on that?
Well, yeah, it's exactly as you said. It's a conflict between a person's consciousness, their conscious mind is sort of separated from their instincts, and their instincts are trying to pull them back according to what, who they actually are fundamentally. And so this conflict in the mind is it's like an inner civil war. There's one part of you that wants to do one thing, another part of you that's begging you to do something else, and then you eventually can't get anything done. It causes a huge amount of mental stress. It's like spreading the butter too thinly over bread. Like, are we stretching ourselves too much in this sort of pursuit of consciousness that our instincts will eventually I mean, it's inevitable that the instincts will force their way out. It's kind of, it's like one of the greatest fears of mankind, that this sort of, this kind of archetypal nature of ourselves will get loose and kind of destroy the world that we've created. And it's a real threat.
Right. It is a real threat. Exactly. And when you say it's a real threat, it was, and it still is a real threat. Now, what Neumann says, and in the Origins and History of Consciousness, is before the hero can properly go through the transformation process, which is an archetypal reunion with the feminine, which he's able to interact with healthily because he has proper consciousness, right? If that happens too early, you get swallowed up again. You get swallowed up again in the Ouroboros. And from a personal point, it's so profound. Let's say I'm trying to stop smoking, or I'm trying to stop drinking, or I'm trying to stop whatever addiction that I've got going on for myself. If I'm too slack with myself too suddenly, well, I get pulled back into the instinct, and the instinct just does with me whatever it wants. It controls me. And these are kind of, and therefore, we have this stage of dualism, because, there's a lot of critique about religion today, which is that it's patriarchal, it's dualist. And that just comes from we got to say a big old thank you, We have to say a thank you to these rituals and to these religions that were able to wrest us, or tried to wrest us, from the overbearing, it's an argument whether the culture that we've built today and the technological advancements that we have today, is it better today than it was before? I mean, look at what we're doing to the universe. But say that there is overall positive progression of humanity. A lot of that has to do with the fact that we've strengthened our consciousness, we've created culture. But
even our morality, our moral sort of like you said, you could argue that this sort of capitalistic world that is sort of patriarchal is causing the planet to degrade. But we're conscious of it. We know that we're doing this, and now there's sort of movements to undo it. So our morality also evolves, and we understand these problems that we're creating, and we try to find solutions to them. So it's an ever-going process, especially on the moral front, because that's also technically a result of our masculinization. Because again, morality itself is this stopping of instinct. But again, our higher consciousness makes us aware of the problems we cause, and then we try to solve them. So it's, it's like you said, we do have to be thankful for these, these very obscure events which happened on this planet, which led to us being like this level of conscious.
Right.
Yeah.
So what Jung was, the Gnostic text, the development of Gnosticism at all, and Neumann talks about this in the Origins of Jewish Consciousness. The development of Gnosticism, which Gnosticism and a lot of Kabbalah, before Hasidism and before the Arizal, who was like a huge expounder on the Kabbalah, they started bringing it to a more acceptance of the feminine, but from a more Gnostic viewpoint, which, what do I want to say, is that Gnosticism viewed sleep and the night and the feminine all as being making a man slip back into a state. So slumber, a state of slumber, a state of slipping back to the subconsciousness. And therefore, there needed to be a separation of Gnosticism, as Norman brings it out in the book. He says that is, we can take a look at the teachings of a time, and we can understand what they were trying to bring us into. So he says that Gnosticism, and the Kabbalah heavily also works, in this way, is that it was rejecting the feminine principle, not because the feminine principle is bad, but because it was not time yet. And okay, so I said that I want to talk about Jesus and Nietzsche. So why do I want to talk about Nietzsche? Is because Nietzsche is the prophet who brings us back to the feminine, brings us back to the instinct. He says that God is not the plenum, God is not the absolute of Aristotle. It's not some great grand idea and disconnected from this world, but he tried to bring us back to the instinct. And if you read Das book Zarathustra, he talks about dancing all the time. It's like, why are you talking about dancing all the time? What's the deal? You know, and he also talks about his serpent and his eagle, and his serpent is his friend. And I mean, and Nietzsche was identified as the Antichrist. Okay, like this dude is, you know, just, and he railed against, he didn't like Christianity. He loved the Old Testament. He loved the Old Testament because the Old Testament is moralization, and the rabbis and Christianity and all the body denial. And of course he doesn't like any of those things, because he, in my eyes, is also a messianic character that is he is the tzaddik, the righteous person, the Messiah, right? That is harbinging and bringing in the world of instinct again. And there's this amazing piece. I think it's the 4th chapter in the first part of Das Book Zarathustra, where there's a conversation between Zarathustra and a youth on the hill. And the youth on the hill, and he comes to him, and Zarathustra starts talking to him about how the youth on the hill is trying to fly up into the heavens. He's always trying to reach these spiritual heights, and he feels alone there. And what does Nietzsche tell to him? Nietzsche says, go down. He says to him, just as a tree reaches its branches upwards, the more it reaches its branches upwards, the more dark and down into the earth, into evil go its roots. And the youth cries out ecstatically, yeah, into evil. Yeah, into evil. And then Zarathustra tells him, well, what you need to do is you need to release the hounds that are barking in your cellar. That's what he tells this youth that's looking wearily into the valley. And that's, you know, in the symbological viewpoint of things, that's saying, unlatch that instinct and let those hounds go. Because as long as you do, you're going to be sick. And there needs to be a reinsertion of the individual and of humanity into the earth. We need to return to the earth. We need to return to here and now. We've done enough phallic sky searching and identification with the father. We need to return to the mother principle. And if we don't, there's going to be serious consequences about it. I mean, that the environmental movement today, and you know, if you were to just take a look, I've ran around in circles of people doing ayahuasca. I'm not sure if you're familiar.
Yeah.
People doing different psychological, ayahuasca and San Pedro, psychedelics, living out in communes in the middle of the forest. And there is a movement, and it seems small, but it's becoming more and more significant, which is of people that want to reconnect with their bodies. They want to reconnect with the feminine. They love Pachamama, you know, which is the I think it's the ancient Indian, like Native American. I don't know exactly where the word Pachamama comes from. I'm not sure. Maybe you can enlighten me on that. But it means the mother principle. Yeah. So Pachamama means returning to the earth. It means returning to the earth. And there's lots of movements, and in Judaism itself, it's also happening as well. I mean, it's our return. Of course, we're inside of the crucible of the changing of these eons, and the eons never change easily, and people are never easily let go of the old gods. Nietzsche ranted against the old gods. Jung saw that. Jung said that when Nietzsche said that God is dead, he said that he was just saying that our current worship and our current conception of God is dying. There's going to be a whole ton of shit going down before we figure out again how to relate to the divinity, whether it's within ourselves, whether it's the mother principle. But you could have heard the cry, God is dead. You could have heard that same cry back at the time when the nature gods stopped being worshipped. And you could have heard the echoing great Pan is dead. That's what Jung writes. And he says that there's a continual death of the gods. There's a continual death of the way that we conceive of divinity, in order that way we can renew our conceptions of the way that the universe works and the way that we worship. Those are just a few things that, you know, I think about when I the large kind of historical and psychological processes that Jung and Neumann were exposed me to personally, which on an individual level was, you know, in my own life, I was going through serious turmoil, which was a result of being disconnected from my body. And that was, you know, part of the reason why I left orthodoxy, or left ritual, and left the over masculine worship, in order to return to that. And Norman was a catalyst for that, for sure. Yeah.
Wow. I mean, if I want to, I mean, take this, I mean, I don't want to take it there necessarily, but I'll discuss it a little bit. But the sort of therapeutic significance of the reconnection with our instincts. Again, there's a sort of productive way to make this work, and a kind of, this is. Jung claimed that Nietzsche was going crazy, and the reason, one of the reasons he was going crazy is because he was so much further than everybody else that nobody could relate to him.
Right.
And one of the things about this is when we talk about the reconnecting with our instincts, we live in a world where we can't reconnect with our instincts in the sense that we can't just become merely instinctual. What we need to do is balance these two worlds of sort of the higher principles and the instinctual world, and find a way so that both can coexist. And this is partly related to the sort of Jungian theme of the integration of the shadow, because the shadow is part of you that you aren't acknowledging, because when you're a conscious individual,
you're afraid of it.
Exactly. Yeah. It's something that you don't want to acknowledge, because it's just, you don't want to look at it. It's like, I don't want to think that I have these sort of biological urges which are beyond my conscious control.
Right.
But of course, there's a necessity of acknowledging these. There's a degree to which just being conscious of them gives you a certain power over them. But there's also a degree, because something like an addiction is an example of this sort of shadow side, which kind of, if somebody wants to quit smoking, it's very difficult, because smoking is very addictive, obviously. I mean, so they're always pulled back into this realm of just habit. But how something like, I mean, smoking is very difficult to actually overcome. But like something similar to that, something that arises from your shadow, what has to happen is there needs to be a way to walk these two paths. And things like simple things like exercise to get some of that archetypal energy out, finding outlets. So creativity itself is one of these ways in which you're sort of the things in your mind that you don't want to acknowledge can kind of be let out and put into a context in which they aren't harmful. Things like that. So, it's very difficult to integrate the shadow. And honestly, even thinking about it, it's like, even when I try to think of Jung's methods of integrating the shadow, they don't seem super effective. But of course, that's kind of the goal of psychology, to find these methods of being able to balance instinct with our higher culture. And there's a lot I can say about this, but you probably are familiar with the motif of overthrowing the father, which is, there's a lot of different angles about that. And, you're probably familiar with the archetype of the self. And I would argue that somebody like Jesus, I mean, Jesus is like the prime example of the archetype of the self. I've been sort of analyzing this archetype as it appears I like to analyze our modern pop culture, because even there you find archetypes which are very historically relevant. They're all over the place, right? But somebody like Jesus is there's so many different elements to Jesus, because I'm not sure if you're familiar with Anthony Stevens, but he's another Jungian, and you can argue he's like kind of like the anti-Erich Neumann, because he takes everything to a very biological level, which is very interesting perspective to take, but it ultimately misunderstands the nature of consciousness, because consciousness, you could argue it's a biological phenomenon, sure, but it's also reinforced by culture and developed by culture, so it's a very cultural process. But somebody like Anthony Stevens, who's purely biological, would just be like, consciousness isn't something that arises from culture; it's something that you're born with, which I don't agree with. But in any case, what he said about Jesus was that Jesus actually represented a very a feminization of, you could sort of argue, the patriarchal Jewish religion, because and the reason he says this is because Jesus was very passive. It's not like he tried to fight against the fact that he was being crucified, like some of the old Greek heroes did or anything. But at the same, and I understand what he means by that, because that is sort of more passive and more feminine. But at the same time, Jesus represents kind of like at the time the furthest a man has gone, like the furthest a man has gone in terms of his consciousness and in terms of his spiritual development. Like, and that's I'm not sure if you're probably maybe familiar with the Dostoevsky story of in the Brothers Karamazov of the Grand Inquisitor. And the theme of this story is the fact what happens in the basic premise is that Jesus returns, and this cardinal immediately arrests him and says, mankind can go no further. What you're going to do is impose such restrictions on our instincts that mankind can no longer take it. no longer take this burden. And ultimately Jesus kisses him and the cardinal releases him, and sort of caught, and the implication being is that we are being forced to go much further than we actually can. And this is this is put as a critique of religion. And of course it is a critique of religion to an extent, but it's also just an acknowledgement of the reality. Like it's kind of sad. I mean, arguably sad, because we live in a world we didn't choose. And it's a beautiful world, I think. Like I just looking at things like technology, you know, I bring up technology a lot, but could you conceptualize something like a computer existing without our sort of highly developed consciousness? It's like this amazing instrument comes into being because of the fact that we're pushing ourselves so hard. And obviously this has consequences. And, you know, I keep circling back to the same point, which is that, you know, we need to find a way to balance these two. And because I keep circling back to the same point, I guess I'll try to take us somewhere else, even though you already touched on it, which is, well, I guess it's funny how everything we talk about is related to everything that we talk about. But what I wanted to ask was, this was a question I wrote earlier, but I guess you kind of answered it, but I guess I'll bring it back up, was like, what was the Jewish equivalent of the dragon fight? Because this is a theme that I see in a lot of different mythologies, and I wanted to ask you that. But then you showed me St. George, and I guess that's the one you admire.
Yeah, I admire St. George because of the things I was going through in my life. Yeah,
I thought of a question that I saw that I wanted to ask you if you knew, which is that horse that St. George is riding upon. Do you in your mind have a psychological interpretation of what the horse represents? Because it's something that occurs over and over.
Well, the thing is that what Neumann said about Pegasus, which I read in.
It's in the Origins, yeah.
Well, the truth is, I have this one I got for 30 shekel, which is like $7. In some Greek Orthodox monastery on the Sea of the Galilee. But I have a nicer one which I bought in the older city, which also has the queen, who is actually captured by the dragon. And also you could see it in I think it's Gustave Doré. I forgot who painted that, the famous neoclassic picture of the woman sitting on a cliff nearby, which is the transformation that he eventually will go through, which is the age-old, you know, killing the dragon and getting the princess. And the horse itself, I do remember Neumann talking about how Pegasus was, I don't remember exactly. I think he was saying that on a symbological level, it helping him kill the how can Hercules kill the Gorgon had some symbological significance, but I don't remember. So if you can help me, that'd be great.
So the context in which Pegasus appears is he's born out of the blood of the slain Gorgon Medusa. So Medusa is killed, and then it gives rise to Pegasus. And well, you know, Medusa is obviously a symbol of the Great Mother. She even has the snake hair. And then, you know, all related to the unconscious, related to the dragon.
Turning you to stone.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Mobilizing you.
Exactly. Petrifying you. Yeah. But this horse symbol, it appeared, my favorite example of it was, I believe it's a Persian myth of Rostrum, I think his name was, and he's a dragon slayer, and the horse helps him with the dragon fight. But Erich Neumann himself doesn't specifically mention this point, but it is related to that, you know, that liberation of the captive, of the feminine principle. But horses and another symbol which is related to horses, and in fact any domesticated animal, because what is a domesticated animal? It's a wild animal that's now serving you. It has a function in society, and it's under your control. So what this horse metaphor, this is kind of my own interpretation, but it does appear consistently enough that I think I'm right here. It represents essentially the fact that you battled the dragon, you battled the unconscious part of yourself, and now to an extent it serves you. I've never ridden a horse. I mean, I have ridden a horse, but it was a very long time ago, and I want to get back into it. But what I hear, I have a lot of friends who ride horses, and what they describe the experience is like, it's like it's like the horse is connected to you essentially, because you're the one giving it commands. And so it feels like an extension of yourself, but it's controlled by your ego, by your higher self. So what the horse fundamentally represents is the fact that because you've battled the unconscious and you've struggled against it, it's now something which serves you. It's now something which kind of becomes automatic, and it's a part of yourself that's now sort of under your control, but also like your friend. It's not, so it's like when you battle against a dragon, you're fighting something which you don't want to fight, because dragons are inherently terrifying. They look like snakes, and we're naturally afraid of snakes. But when you transform it into the horse image, which again is related to that feminine, that liberation of the feminine side, it becomes something which serves you, and which becomes something which is useful to you. And the metaphor I always give of this, because I always find it to be the best metaphor, but of course there's a lot of metaphors, is when you learn how to play an instrument. Because like I have a guitar back there, I don't play it very well. But when I do try to play it, when I try to learn something, it's like a very frustrating experience, because you make a mistake.
The same way.
Yeah, it's like you don't want to do this, because like it's such a burden to like have to do it. But if you force yourself, if you wrestle with that part of yourself that's resisting you, you begin to be able to do it automatically. So like when you do something automatically, that's subconscious, right? You don't need your conscious ego to control yourself. So it's like your conscious, exactly. Your body is able to do things because your conscious ego instructed it, and it's now automatic. And I think that's what the metaphor is trying to get at. And Neumann points to the symbol multiple times, but he doesn't state that explicitly.
Yeah, that's a really good point. That's very interesting. I like that a lot. I mean, in general, it's the integration of the shadow that helps. It's often an integration of the shadow, which could also be, I mean, the coming out of the blood of the Gorgon is Pegasus, which could be, it's integration of the shadow, which I always see it the most in Gilgamesh. Gilgamesh has to defeat Enkidu, which is this hairy, primitive being, right? And then after he submisses, how do you say?
Good question.
After Enkidu becomes submissive to Gilgamesh,
yes,
because Gilgamesh defeats him in battle, the two of them go, and they go into the dark, deep forest, the forest of chaos, and they defeat Humbaba there, right? And that's it's so interesting, and that shows up often, is that the hero has to be able to have a degree of inculcating the shadow within himself, because the shadow and the body in general. Nietzsche said that you have your body knows, like in 1 inch of your body knows more than your brain will ever know, which Nietzsche, of course, was trying to return to instinct. And that kind of acts as a bridge to the question that you asked before, which is, what is Judaism's mythological fight with the dragon? Well, you have in the Bible, you have the fight, you have the snake. But the snake kind of wins. The snake gets Eve to touch the tree. There is a verse there, which when God curses the snake, he says, "You will bite at the heel of man, and man will crush your head with his heel." But there isn't any it kind of just talks about the fall, and then after that, there's really no serpentine. There is in Exodus, there is these strange verses that happen with this snake coming to swallow up Moses, and therefore he has to circumcise his child. But besides that, there isn't a lot of snake imagery showing up in the Bible, which is strange, because, I mean, of course, this depends when you believe that the Bible was written.
Are you familiar with there's one story that I've seen on Wikipedia pages, but I haven't delved into it, of Leviathan, I believe his name is. And
the Leviathan. Okay, yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
Well, I mean, I don't know much about it, so if you could elaborate, that would be great.
Leviathan, it doesn't actually show up in imagery. It is mentioned in the Bible. Leviathan, which is the Hebrew for saying, this is the Leviathan. This is in Psalms. This is the Leviathan that you have created in order to play with. Or now in Jewish mythology itself. Now again, the serpent shows up all the time in Kabbalah, because what are you going to do? That is the basic archetypal subconscious text, the esoteric text. In the esoteric text, you're always going to be getting serpents, or what we call the Sitra Achra. Which is the other, which literally means the other side. And I think that the symbolism of the snake doesn't show up often in Judaism, because Judaism or Hebraism, even though there is a heavily identification with the masculine in the beginning, at the end of the day, we're not trying to defeat the dragon. In Judaism, and I think that this was a large reason why the rabbis that created rabbinic Judaism rejected Jesus and rejected the teachings, was because they saw it as being too heavy of a departure from the physical world. They saw it as being too heavy of an identification, too heavy of an explicit identification with the masculine principle. Jesus has things inside, from the Gospels. You have Jesus saying that people should, very against divorce. If your right hand is causing you to sin, cut off your hand. Whoever does not need to take a wife should not take a wife. Which, by the way, in the monastic fathers afterwards, you have these stories of the desert fathers, or of the people who are most venerated as holy people in the Orthodox Church. I don't know what it's like in the Roman Catholic Church. Are the people that are able to overcome the greatest urges. And you have there's an amazing picture. I can't manage to find it. If somebody could somehow show me it. In the 19th century, there's this French painter that painted one of the monastic fathers. It's called The Temptation of This Father. And you see in the picture behind him, he's holding his head like this, like he's about to go crazy. And you have all these nude kind of women behind him. And he has his eyes focused on the cross. Which is, which is the ultimate, I will not, regress into the urge of my body. I am going to connect to the Christ ideal, and that is what brings salvation to the world. And in Judaism, we're like, hold on a second, buddy. We're not about disconnecting from the world. We're about trying to bring rectification to the world. And that shows up in Kabbalah all the time, which is there's this idea that of the broken vessels, and this world is a broken vessel, and that inside of the broken vessel, and inside the vessel and the light being consciousness, spirituality, and the vessel being the material world, and the vessel is broken. It was broken by the overdose of light of creation. This is kind of the cosmogenic. We could do another video afterwards, by the way, if you'd like, or in this video I can go into of how the Kabbalistic cosmogonic, I think that's how you cosmogenic. How do you pronounce
cosmogenic? Yeah, cosmogonic.
Cosmogony. Yeah. The Kabbalistic cosmogony actually is mimics the hero, as the hero story. The Kabbalistic cosmogony process of how God created the world is very similar to the process that the hero goes through, and how the individual has to wrest himself from the unconsciousness and then eventually come back to it. But anyway, Judaism, I think that Judaism in general, and this is the importance of the law, that Judaism, as in the church saw that we are now inside of the era of mercy, and there is no more need for the law. Whereas Judaism is like, no, the law, which has a very strict connotation, is actually telling you how to interact with the physical world, because we want to bring a rectification to the physical world. And that I always felt was, and that, and I think that, I know that you're a Christian, but I think it's, a criticism of Christianity is that, and it could be for any religion as well. You can also have this criticism about Judaism, about Islam, about any patriarchal, is that in our hastiness to kill the dragon, we've killed a lot of our own instinct instead. And we are currently, as a society, I don't know if it's Christianity is to blame. Nothing's to blame. It's just nobody's to blame, because this is necessary in order for us to move into the next stage of consciousness. We are limping. We are limping on individual level and on a society level. We, and there needs to, as we continue to say, there needs to be a return to the shadow, towards the feminine. But as long as, and I don't know what your eschatological beliefs are, but as long as there's this kind of, in my eyes, as long as there's this kind of blind hoping for the masculine, for the return of Jesus, or the return of the masculine principle to come and save the world, it's like, no, we got to open up our eyes. We have to see we are the ones responsible for saving the world. And we have to take the next step. And just like and just as the transformation of and the importance of these religions, of Christianity and of Jesus' message and of Buddha's message of coming into consciousness, we have to realize that no less importance is the switch of the era that's happening right now, and our ability to shift modes and shift focus. And I think that that's what's happening. I think that the throwing off of the mantle of tradition and the rising move of feminism is a move in this direction. Whether it's healthy or it's not healthy, but there is definitely, our ability, you and I, our ability to live within a feminine world, because we have so conquered nature, for good or for bad, is much easier for us to just be. I mean, humans were generally like, if the average male throughout history, either you were conscripted to an army and sent to war, or you were working your fields day and night in order to put some food on the table. You didn't have any time, and you had to have this, ritual, and you had to understand when, and ritual that sanctifies the times of the year, sanctifies time in general. I mean, because otherwise you would not survive. Yeah, I've ranted a little bit there, so I don't know. Maybe
no, that's well. I mean, yeah, that's well, there's a point there you touched on that I was wanting to ask about. Well, no, there was a point there I want to elaborate on, which was that I definitely agree with you in that we are sort of entering this more feminine age. But I mean, there's a lot of different shifts in society and a lot of different shifts in psychology. And I see like we are kind of lessening our sort of religious constraints a lot, especially, I live in the place where I live. People aren't as openly religious as they were before. And even if they are religious, they aren't highly observant and follow these rules to the teeth. They're more flexible with them. And I see that as kind of like a feminine permission to just, it's okay now. Like we've reached this state where we don't need to push so hard. It's like we can relax a little bit. And I think we've earned it to a degree. Our ancestors toiled under the sun to give us the life that we have now. And I don't think they did so just so that we could also suffer. I think they did so to survive. But the world that they gave us, I think we should enjoy it because they gave it to us. It's like kind of like enjoying the gift that we've received. But of course, like I said before, there's a lot of different shifts in society. And one of the shifts I see, this is probably a bit controversial, is definitely, I see the feminine, that men are sort of becoming more feminine in a lot of ways, and women are becoming a lot more masculine in a lot of ways. And I think, the reason we could argue that women are becoming more feminine is because it's part of their hero's journey. Masculine, yeah. That women are becoming more masculine is because it's kind of like their hero's journey towards a higher consciousness. Because I think it's no secret that for a lot of history, men have been sort of the emphasis of our conscious development. They've received more of the education, they've been given more of the authority, whereas women,
naturally, as the transpersonal development always actualizes itself within the personal aspect, and the transpersonal is masculine, and therefore the masculine is, on the personal level and reality level, the more important factor is the man, for that age. And you're sorry. So you were saying that the development of the female.
Yeah. Well, I again, like women these days are becoming more educated, taking on more responsibilities. And I like what I was saying was that I see this as a part of their hero story, as becoming as sort of taking on more of the masculine role, because again, both men and women have the masculine and feminine principles within themselves, and they can be utilized to different degrees. And I see the sort of shift in today's society is that men are sort of leaning more on their feminine side, in certain ways, not in every way. And of course, there are obviously ambitious men who are pushing the limits of our consciousness and not receding, or not. I guess receding isn't the right word, but more like feminizing, I guess. But of course, because women, I think it's kind of a necessary development, and one that was inevitable, that women would sort of go more towards the conscious end of the spectrum and develop their heroic potential, and kind of, because again, women have just the same amount of potential as we do, and so by developing that, it's also good for humanity as well. But it's interesting that that is a cultural shift that we're observing. It kind of implies that we haven't we haven't seen the end of this story yet. Like it's still going places, and it will continue to go places. And as it develops, it might go to places that were completely unexpected. But of course, I think having an understanding of the archetypal psychology and the archetypal patterns of consciousness can give you a lot of foresight into into what will happen in history. Like, you know, even these past few weeks, I feel like I've been able to anticipate the events that just happen in the news just because of me knowing psychology. So you know, there's that.
100%. I mean, I think also whenever I have these conversations with Neumann or whenever I have theoretical conversations, I like to usually start them by saying there's theory and then there's, I don't know, a thing of what's going on. So I agree with you, by the way. And like, I mean, when you read Neumann, when you read Jung, you definitely feel like you have these historical, and I also think that it's important though for us to develop this kind of this necessary humility when we deal with these things, which is also, I have no idea what the hell's going on.
We definitely, you know, like that's the thing I keep having to tell people. Like, I am not sure about any of this.
Right.
I have the feeling that it's right, but like I can't tell you that it's right the same way I can tell you 2 + 2 = 4. I can just explain the theories and you can kind of see how they match on the history, but I can't my certainty with this, like I have to tell people a lot, because like people are like, well, why are you like so heavily invested in somebody who's pretty much just like speaking, you know, without like, because the sort of methods that Jung and Neumann use, they aren't like on par, I would say, with today's sort of scientific way of understanding the world. But at the same time, like Neumann and Jung offer us such an interesting way to study something, which is that they conducted these very intense studies of individual people and studied their minds super closely and Jung analyzed something like tens of thousands of dreams. And when you study dreams that intensively, you begin to notice patterns. Like it inevitably happens. And that's what he based his theories off of. But it's not as if he did an experiment, you know, because you can't, the human mind is not something you can experiment with. It's subjective, right? It's like, I have my own experience. I can't see your consciousness. I only have my consciousness to go off of. And so it's not subject to these kinds of things like science is. But of course, that's why I find it so much more interesting, because it's such an intense study of things which are kind of difficult to grasp.
Right. I mean, Jung himself was able. Jung, I mean, the Red Book that he wrote was, I would like to know if he used psychedelics. I don't know if he did or not, but he was coaxing. He was coaxing out his subconscious on a nightly basis for 3 years, and I actually recently ordered a book by Peter Kingsley. Are you familiar with Peter Kingsley?
I'm not actually.
You should. He had it. He just wrote a book called Cataflaque. It's Cataflaque, which is, the subtitle is Carl Jung and the End of Humanity, where he pretty much, I haven't read it, but I read a few reviews of it. I ordered a book called In the Dark Places of Wisdom, in which he pretty much traces religious practices. He talks about, he's big on Parmenides and Pythagoras, on these mystical philosophers who were incredibly practical and brought Western civilization to what it is today. They planted the seeds of Western civilization. And there's a very interesting interview in which he said that Jung knew that what would happen. Jung knew that he was going to be like, that there's always the great teacher, and then there's always the people who bring in, who always create religion out of that great teacher. So there's Jesus, and then there's Christianity. And so what Peter Kingsley says there, there's a 43-minute interview. There's not a lot of his interviews. He's incredible though. And there's a 43-minute interview, and which starts talking about how the clinical Jungians that create these schools, which I guess are also important if they're helping people, but that what Jung demanded was and what Jung wanted was the individual delve into the depths of his subconscious, and to meet the shadow, and to start being in touch with with the archetypal parts of himself. And I always
when I meet people who are not strong necessarily in their, or they don't know a lot about their faith, and they're having trouble in life, I usually tell them, if they're Muslim, I say, go read the Quran, go read, go get in touch with these roots, and go get in touch with, try to be in touch with the esoteric roots as well, and try to be in touch with the archetypal symbols and contents that are part of your culture or in a different culture, but get in touch with the subconscious somehow, because it's so necessary. And yeah, in Judaism, this was Hasidism. And the Hasidism is taking the Kabbalah and making it more nagish. How do you say in English? Making it more accessible and instantiating practice and putting a lot more focus on prayer, but prayer being the deep delves into the inner worlds. And Hasidism put a huge emphasis on the feminine as well, whether it was in the form of the Sabbath, whether there are certain Hasidic teachings, which means that a man needs to get out of the dimness of his father, and then he needs to get out of the dimness of his mother, right? The dullness, which, of course, Neumann picked up on that as being the slang of the parents, of the world parents. And then eventually the person can start to develop how a person needs to develop the feminine qualities within themselves. On a practical level, how did we do that? I don't know. I mean, personally,
the trend today seems to be, I've been observing that the trend seems to be today to be the use of psychedelic drugs. I mean, there are obviously other methods which are definitely
psychedelic.
Yeah, well,
all right.
But I'll say for such as like, for example, this is kind of a weird thing to bring up, but I'm similar to Jung in a lot of ways, in a lot of the ways he experiments, where I experiment with my mind a lot, and like for example, I have lucid dreams, and I'm an avid lucid dreamer, and I can do it spontaneously. Like for example, tonight, or not tonight, I guess during the day, but I could plan to lucid dream and then do it because for some reason, if I wake up at a certain time and then go back to sleep, I'll have a lucid dream. But I could also have sleep paralysis from that. And so I've had a lot of sort of psychic experiences.
Sleep paralysis is scary shit, huh?
Yeah, I'll tell you one story actually, and I never told this to my viewers. I've had a lot of scary experiences, but the scariest, it was scary while it happened, but after it happened, I reflected on it, and I kind of love it now. But it was scary when it happened. It was terrifying when it happened. But I woke up in sleep paralysis, like this, kind of opened my eyes, looked at, and the thing is, it's hard to tell what's happening in sleep paralysis. I can't tell if my eyes are actually open or if I'm just imagining.
Or you're dreaming that your eyes are opening. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly, right. But it felt kind of real, and I woke up and there was a demon on my chest. Are
you familiar with the picture?
Yeah, I've seen that picture as well. Yeah. And I'd say it looked like that, only like, when you imagine something like a demon, like in your head, like in my head, I imagine something that's like, CGI, computer generated. When I saw this thing as looking at it, it was like a real demon. Like it was an actual demon sitting there on my chest. Yeah. It was a very small guy. And he bounced up and down, and every time he bounced, my chest kind of just went up.
Yeah. Really?
It was horrifying when it happened. And that's not the only thing that happened in sleep paralysis. I've also seen like things floating above me, it was like a jacket or something.
Yeah, sure.
It was really weird. But that one was really, really weird. But of course, I've had a lot of dream experiences like that, and most of them positive, some of them terrifying. I'll tell you, this is going on a tangent. We're supposed to be talking about Neumann here, but
that's all right. No, this is definitely part of it.
Yeah, this is definitely related to the exploration of the unconscious. But like I said before, I'm an avid lucid dreamer, and one of the things that I do every single lucid dream is I'll examine the environment that I'm in and just look at something and to kind of compare it with my conscious experience when I'm awake. And every single time, I don't know if you'll believe this or not, every single time I come to the horrifying conclusion that everything in a dream world, a dream is very unvivid, right? It's like when you remember a dream, it's like very hard to tell what happened and like what was going on. But if you're lucid during a dream and you look at an object, I swear to you, and in my experience anyways, it looks exactly the same and has exactly the same amount of detail as something in real life. So I'd look at my hand And I'd be like, wait a second, this is exactly the same as my hand when I'm awake. And this is, you have to be
Really?
Yeah, you have to be it's a very weird experience. And I don't know what the implications of that are. There are probably a lot. It probably has something to do with the way the mind sort of generates reality, and the fact that it can probably regenerate reality exactly to a very high degree in a dream. And the reason why this is surprising to a lot of people is because dreams don't feel like that. Dreams feel very like dreamlike, like they're not real.
Yeah, exactly.
But like
the dimensions off.
Exactly, yeah, something's weird. The time isn't going
right.
Running. Yeah. And like events just kind of just happen randomly. One thing leads to another, but you can't remember how you got started. But like if you do have a lucid dream, and have you ever had a lucid dream or like anything similar to that?
I've had like moments where I realized, oh hey, let's do this.
Mm-hmm.
But nothing on that. Like definitely I would not call myself an avid dreamer.
Yeah.
and usually the second where I do that and I realize that I'm in the dream, then I'm already starting to wake up from it.
Oh yeah, that happens. because consciousness, you're not supposed to be conscious in the dream, you're supposed to be waking up.
Right.
So I guess when you become conscious that you're dreaming, you wake up. But of course, sometimes it doesn't happen.
I would definitely attribute that to a weak ability on my part, which it caused a lot of sickness for me, and it's something that I'm working on now, which is the ability to allow the unconscious. Because I'm afraid of slipping in ego death. Yeah, just like do not overtake me. It's terrifying, right?
It's the same as death. It comes from your fear of death. You don't want to. The reason your ego doesn't want to die is because you don't want to die in general. So it's very difficult to let go during some of those experiences. But as I was saying before, with respect to the dream, there's one thing I wanted to add. The fact that like the world hasn't, like another example, I took a leaf off of a tree while I was in a lucid dream, and I do this every time I have a lucid dream. I looked at it and I'm like, this is a real leaf, and I couldn't believe it. I was mind boggled in my dream. I was like, why is this so realistic? It's like it's actually there. But when you become this is just kind of miscellaneous tales, but when you become good at this, you start having fun in your lucid dreams. So like recently I've been flying around, flying to like different planets. I flew to the moon in a recent lucid dream.
Oh dude, wow. Have you seen Waking Life?
Waking Life? No.
You haven't seen A Waking Life?
I feel like if somebody told me to watch that. What was that? What is it?
It's all about dreams. It's like a half cartoon. It's like very interesting animation the way that they do it.
And I have seen this. Yeah, I have seen
it. Okay.
It's like the philosophy movie, right?
Yeah, it's very philosophical, and there's one part where he's in this room. There's this guy playing a ukulele, and there's another dude that he meets, and that dude says, and then once you realize you're dreaming, then you can have some fun.
Yeah. So yeah, like that. But like
so it seems that you're very in touch with your subconscious, and is that something? Is that something? I also saw that you had a video on the Precambrian mind.
You mean the bicameral?
Anyway, bicameral. That's the word.
Okay, because the Precambrian is like it's a period in Earth's history, and like it's so long ago. It's so long ago that there would not have been minds. Like
there's been a mind at that point. There's the mind of the world.
The
mind
world
of God.
Mind. Yeah, the all.
World mind, exactly. The all.
Yeah, the bicameral mind. Yeah, that's another. Yeah. That's another like there's connections between that theory and Jungian theory, which. So the author of that book, I'm not sure how familiar you are with that, but you should also
not. And
there's also a lot of Jewish scholars who've connected that area with their own Jewish faith, and so they've in a similar way to Neumann have sort of enriched Judaism through an exploration of this theory. But it's a super interesting theory on many fronts. There's a part of me that doesn't believe it is exactly it could have occurred exactly as it is described. But there's a definite part of me that it makes perfect sense, because you have all of these stories in the Bible and in huge number of religions of people having these direct communications with God, and the question is why? Why are people talking with God? Did they just make it up, or was there something going on? And the short answer is that they were having a conversation effectively with the subconscious part of their mind. Which kind of presents itself as the other. It doesn't present itself as your ego. It presents itself as an external authority figure, and that authority figure had the role of controlling this person the same way this kind of superego does. Like it tells it, it would have sort of been the instructor of the law. It would have been the holder of the, for example, the commandments. It would have been the thing that tells you to obey these.
That actually is really interesting, because a huge part of the origins of Jewish consciousness is Neumann's exploration of what is Jewish propheticism. What is the Jewish prophetic principle?
Mm-hmm.
And in contrast to the rituals which were trying to destroy consciousness and try to bring consciousness back down into the collective consciousness, where the individual couldn't really create his own consciousness, the prophetic principle was based in tension. It's tension in between the fact that you awaken unconscious materials, but you don't give yourself over to them necessarily. Now, I want to say a few things, just a little bit about prophecy.
Mm-hmm.
All the greatest prophets, whether it's Muhammad, there's a tradition about Muhammad that, first of all, he would often go off by himself to be inside of caves, which we see in the New Testament all the time with Jesus as well. He's going off by himself, go pray. And Moses also is a shepherd, and all the great people are shepherds. So when you start to have quiet, this is a very Jungian and Neumannian way of looking at things, which is when you start to have quiet, you're able to start to get in touch with deeper levels of your subconscious. And I think that it's kind of like, I got this one from Jordan Peterson. When you walk into a room and you turn on the light, for the first second, sometimes you think you see something. You can see a tube on the floor, and you'll think it's a snake. And then afterwards, that's not a snake. That's just a tube.
Mm-hmm.
So there was kind of a second where your mind projected onto reality a certain content. And that's kind of like how in your dreams, you think that this leaf is completely and totally real, that your brain is creating reality. And I think that the consciousness, you're able, through certain meditative practices, to get to a point at which you hear, or you're far more deeply in touch with the subconscious. And I think that the world is speaking all the time to us. There is a way in which we interact with the world that is talking to us, because it's us, and then there's the world and the way that we interact with it, and there's other people in our life, there's other objects in our life, and there's different events that happen to us, and we try to make sense of it. And so then the people who are, and in Hebrew the word prophet is navi, which has the root of lehavi, which is to bring. And Neumann saw the prophets as delving into the depths, being able to delve into the depths, having a strong enough consciousness because they're identified with the masculine principle, and being able to bring the new ethic out of there, and bring it and that which is the herb of life, or however else it shows up within mythology. That is what the prophet does. The prophet is able, because his consciousness is so strong, he's able to descend into madness without going mad. And Peter Kingsley talks about it, and Jung talked about it as well, which is that you have to go through hell if you're going to get to the other side of, if you're in hell, if you find yourself in hell, keep going. Which is this idea that you have to confront, and in order to bring whether it's bringing to your culture or whether it's bringing to yourself, you have to go through a significant amount of pain and of coming to consciousness in general is a realization that is wound up part and parcel with pain. And so the prophet, and Neumann talks about this a lot. Neumann talks about how the Sinai event, the revelation event, and Yud-He Vav-He, or Yahweh, or Yehovah, or the Adonai, the God of the Old Testament, demands his prophets to have a strong conscious element, which isn't something that necessarily shows up, according to, if we take Neumann's word for it, in the surrounding area at that time.
Wow. So there was a point there that I wanted to jump on, which is
Sure.
it's like you said, like you have to go through hell to kind of produce. I mean, I don't know what the word for it is, but like to to bring things from our unconscious, which ultimately enrich the world. And that's why you see so many great men like Nietzsche, like Jung, who suffer immensely during their lives. Like Nietzsche's life, just reading an account of it, I was like, oh my goodness, what this man had to go through. But like what, as a result, he kind of gave us this immensely profound philosophy. And it seems like that's the general pattern. Suffering does, I don't want to say suffering has a function, because a lot of people suffer and it just kind of, it's hard to justify somebody suffering by telling them, hey, you have a purpose. But it kind of does have a function. It kind of eventually does have a function. A lot of people who suffer end up gifting the world kind of what they learn through their suffering.
Right.
But the other thing that the more positive thing that I wanted to jump on was the fact that this kind of delving into the unconscious, as the prophets kind of do, as you explained, that's what's happening from a Jungian perspective, and they're able to deliver. I don't know what the word for it. Like, what is it that about going into the unconscious that allows us to bring something new into the world? Because I've experienced this before, where all my bouts of creativity itself is not something which our conscious minds do. I've been studying the psychology, recent findings on the psychology of consciousness, and it's very clear that consciousness has very little to do with creativity. Creativity is when your unconscious mind synthesizes things which are just kind of flowing around in your mind, and you're able to produce something new from that. Consciousness does have a role in taking that, whatever you receive from your unconscious mind, and sort of putting it on paper. So like if you're an artist, you kind of have to consciously work on the art. But sort of the creative process itself kind of just comes from your unconscious. And of course, that's the feminine side. So it's the feminine side which kind of rejuvenates and regenerates and brings something new, as you were alluding to.
Yeah, Neumann talked about, and I'm sure Jung talked about it before, is the reacclamation to reclaim the reclamation of the child is a necessary step in creativity.
Yeah,
and that sometimes I'm very into Jack Kerouac, if you're familiar.
Jack Kerouac, that's a familiar name.
Jack Kerouac was a writer of the 1950s. He wrote On the Road, which was his famous book. But if you read his journals, he scribbles absolute gibberish often. And he was very in touch with this, and the subconscious is in touch with both from in Neumann, in Jungian psychology, and in mythology, the child who identifies the world as being itself, and there isn't the separation yet, and that in the universal developmental of development of consciousness is still in the Ouroboros stage. It's still weaning from its mother. It's still heavily dependent. Other parents there is no aspect of consciousness within the child. It's totally living within the unconscious world. That's something that needs to be the child needs to be reinculcated into consciousness and the child or the shadow in order for creativity to actually happen. And I think I don't know, I'm not such a big fan of modern art today. I think art today is a little bit shitty, personally. And I think, and I think it's our hyper consciousness is to blame for it. And yeah, it's so amazing that you can read. Yeah, go ahead.
I pulled up a quote that was related to what you said, and it's a paraphrase from Terence McKenna, but he attributes it to Heraclitus, who says the aeon is a child at play with colored balls. And so what he's meaning is that it's this childlike, it's like what you were saying, this childlike nature where we kind of give ourselves freedom. And it's interesting that you mentioned that author. What was his name again? I think I pulled it up just to see. Jack Kerouac. You said like he has notes, like tons of notes that are just nonsense.
He has a lot of nonsense poems. I mean, this is somebody who was deeply in touch with like the subconscious. Yeah. He also grew up Roman Catholic. He grew up Roman Catholic as well. And he had a lot of, I always call him the last saint of America, because he ran around impoverished throughout America and just hearing the stories and writing down the stories of the impoverished there and trying to, he talks about St. Francis all the time, who is my favorite Catholic saint, by the way.
St. Francis? That's why I love these conversations. I get to learn about these new people, and I'm like, okay, time to research. I have like a list going of all the.
You don't know about St. Francis?
Well, no, I know about St. Francis, of course, but but Jack Kerouac, because like what you described about like his gibberish notes, I'm like, I relate to that too. I have like thousands of pages of notes, which are just me like just automatically writing just to see what comes out of it. So like,
I got to get back to that. I used to do that. Well, I have a good 500 pages of that.
yeah,
on my
I mean,
computer.
it's interesting. Every time I do it, after I do it, I don't know what it is, but I feel like something has been accomplished. I don't know what has been accomplished, but I feel like something that was in my mind that needed to get out has been released. And
Yeah, for sure.
it's something that I recommended in one of my other videos, because everybody's looking for ways to explore the unconscious. And with with psychedelics, that's a viable method, but there's also risks involved. And I think I mean, if we discuss the topic of psychedelics, one of the reasons that I was so interested in Jungian psychology is because of the same reason that Terence McKenna was originally. I'm pretty sure you're familiar with him. Why he?
A little bit.
Yeah, why he was interested in Jungian psychology is because
People have told me that I look like him a little bit.
You do actually, yeah, especially with your current hair.
The curly hair.
Yeah, but and you're also similar in personality to him based on his talks, like the way he would talk and be really like enthusiastic while also being kind of going on tangents here and there, but it made for really interesting conversations. But in any case,
I'll have to be watching these videos.
Yeah, he's a great speaker, but the reason he was so interested in Jung is because he needed a map of the unconscious to sort of help him with his psychedelic experiences, because he would go into these psychedelic experiences and it would be kind of chaotic and random, and he would feel enlightened, but not really have any sort of stability or any sort of understanding of what just occurred. And when he discovered Jung, he found that he could sort of contextualize his experiences and sort of see the themes that would sort of arise in these fantasies, these sort of psychedelic fantasies that would also appear in mythology. And you can understand why they were appearing, the sort of historical reason, and sort of why his unconscious mind would lead him in this direction. And so that's why I was interested in Jung, because I thought, okay, this guy can help me sort of explore my own unconscious mind and give me a map. And so I think psychedelics and Jung go together fairly well. It's just, again, with something like psychedelics, it's kind of controversial. There kind of has to be an element of caution if people want to get involved in that. But I do think that if there's a certain context, like especially something like ayahuasca, in which Jungian psychology and the insights of Neumann are very helpful, because again, psychedelics in terms of Jungian theory, is this allowing yourself to dive into your unconscious and allowing your ego to dissolve. And what you find there are sort of the archetypes of your unconscious, as well as elements of your personal unconscious. And you can learn a great deal from that. And now there's also a lot happens during a psychedelic experience, because again, the unconscious mind, since it's such a huge repository of information as compared to the conscious mind, there's a lot of sort of ideas floating around in there, which your brain has been kind of synthesized. In fact, some would argue that the purpose of your unconscious mind is to sort of find things which you've experienced in conscious life that are useful and kind of re-represent them to you in your dream in kind of like a simulated environment, so that you can learn from them.
That's what the symbol is.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, right. And so that. So I think if what we do need to do is reconnect with our unconscious minds, I do think that this is a way to do it. It's just that there needs to be a way to facilitate the experience, so that it's not, because sometimes I've heard that these can be very traumatic experiences for people. So there has to be a way to facilitate the experience. Then I think we were talking about like smoking addiction earlier. There's a study that was done, I think, by John Hopkins, that was able to treat people's addiction to smoking about 80% of the time using
psilocybin.
Yeah, psilocybin, right? With a psychotherapist involved. So I think psychotherapist facilitated psychedelic experiences can be very beneficial.
Right, and I'll say that, and this is just generally how Neumann helped me through explaining the prophetic principle to me.
Mm-hmm.
I also understood the other principle, which is the priestly principle. And there's an interesting in Exodus 3, chapter 3. There's Moses is about to go take the Jewish people out of Israel, and there he meets Aaron, and they hug and they kiss, and then they go to take out the people from Egypt. What the hell is going on over there? Like, why do they need? And where do they meet? They meet on Mount Moriah, which is the place where the Torah or the revelation eventually happens.
So in addition, putting aside historical, I believe that the Bible is a mix of history and mythology and archetypes as well. So from the archetypal standpoint, what's going on over here? Well, we have Moses, who is the archetypal prophet. He's the one that gets revelation. And what we know about Moses is that he's not very good at speaking. Mm-hmm. He actually, and there's different Jewish myths about why that is, because he ate a coal when he was young, or whatever else. He says, "Kaved pe anochi," I am of a heavy mouth, and he's the prophet. And then we have Aaron, who's the priest. Aaron is the archetypal priest, and he's the one that is in charge. And then the sons of Aaron are eventually in charge of the ritual that goes on inside of the temple. So what do we have here? Well, we have, and you can also split this up into right brain, left brain. A schema, if you'd like to. You have revelation, which is the pure ability to be in touch with the unconscious and what the unconscious wants from you. And then, I've had this unconscious experience. Now, how the hell do I instantiate what I've learned? How do I bring in practically what I learned from my unconscious experience into my conscious life? Well, for that you have ritual, and for that you have the priests. Right. So for the temple, you have the temple needs to be a certain length, a certain width. You have to bring sacrifices at a certain time of the day, and you have to, and you have to take this revelational experience, and that has implications for the way that you run your life. That helps you be in touch. The fact that you've brought it down, and that you've brought down the prophetic revelation into reality. Being in touch with those different rituals that you do helps you get back and be in touch again with the revelational aspect. Now, what happens? Those are two, and again, prophecy in a certain sense, prophecy is also in the Kabbalah is generally identified with the feminine aspect, not the masculine aspect. Why? Because you have to be an ability to receive. You have to make yourself a receptacle, right? In order to receive the subconscious conscious, because if you don't let your ego die, then you just stay conscious throughout the whole entire thing. So you have to be able to be very feminine, and that's kind of the word of God is coming through you. You have to have an ability to be flow, to be in bittul, to be what is, which is the Jewish concept of nullification of the self. And the priestly is generally identified. The priestly acts are generally identified with the more masculine. And but what happens is that there's a separation of the principles, and which if you go to either one of the extremes, you have sickness and you have a problem. And a big part of in Jewish society today, well, there's a whole entire revival today inside of Jewish society, mainly inside of Israel, a little bit in the exile. When they say the exile, I mean outside of Israel, but of a revival of the people who are trying to come to. It sounds very mystical and not rooted, but there are people who are trying to renew the prophetic principle, which is being in touch, and a lot of it is being done through psychedelics. Just from the circles that I've been running around in general, because they see that the priestly principle, which was the work in the temple, a very patriarchal, and which eventually became the halacha, or the way of life, was becoming the masculine, was over masculinized, and that there's imbalance. And that with our return as the people to the land, to the feminine principle of land, there's also a renewal of the propheticism. There is in Judaism, there's a teaching which says a wise man, a chacham adif min avi. A wise man is preferable to a prophet, which was something that was said in regards to a switch in history when prophecy disappeared. So we're done with the age of prophecy, which is this ability to be in touch with the unconscious elements. And we've gone to where the wise man is more important. And what the wise man does is that through morality, through culture, through consciousness, he's able to bring adif, it says is preferable. Right, he's able to bring humanity to a place where it needs to get to, which it couldn't have gotten. Because if you look through the Bible, if you look through the books of Samuel and Kings, what you have is the continuing problem that the Jewish people the Israelites, they sin, or they worship foreign gods. They're avodah zarah, which is foreign gods. And then God rises up for them a prophet, and he rescues them. And the prophet says, "No, no, no! You guys are doing bad. Go back to worshiping God, to worshiping Yehovah." And God saves them. And then again, despite all the power of the prophet and his ability to speak the word of God, we weren't getting anywhere.
Mhm.
So then, the development after that is, okay, we need to have a different way of interacting. We need to have a different way of bringing man into consciousness. We can't keep having these one prophets that talk with God and everybody forgets what they say afterwards. Because also when you open up the subconscious, then the ability to have foreign worship there is much greater, right? Because this is a big rant, but you can cut it off whenever you see fit.
No, go on.
But there's this idea. Yeah. There's this, and if I'm not making sense, just ask for clarification, or you can stop me. But there's this idea inside of Judaism, which is that when foreign worship disappeared, people that did foreign worship, what was foreign worship? It was people were bowing down to trees. They saw divinity inside of trees. That is like a very high spiritual level, or a very high level of being in touch with the universe. They were very alive. And the rituals that they did were in tandem with that. They would dance around, and they would sacrifice something very bloody, very instinctual, filled with the body, filled with energy, right? And then eventually, we kind of sacrificed that. Instead, we got, which was, as we said before, a necessary development was Christianity and identification with the Father and ritual that needs to happen. And there in Judaism, and which comes out of the sources in the Talmud and the Mishnah and in the Kabbalah, which they identify that the people who are doing foreign worship, it's because they were so deeply in touch with the subconscious. And when you're in that subconscious world, everything's funky, everything seems to be put with significance, charged with libidal energy. And so there was this, in the historical process, tried to bring man away from that, but it came at the cost of a very instinctual and alive connection with nature and with the Word of God. And again, and in Judaism, there's this idea that will come back, that will return,
that will walk with nature once again.
Yeah, that will walk with nature once again, or that our ability to interact with God will not be one of which it'll be, I hope that, again, we're able to even have that, the fact that somebody can go and worship a tree and see divinity inside of the tree, not just because somebody told them to go bow down to a tree, but because they go and bow down to a tree because they see, whoa, look at this tree, man. It's blowing my mind, which is something that, by the way, if you're taking psychedelics, is totally something that happens.
Yeah.
Right? So, but the ability to get to that point with, and by the way, they were definitely using psychedelics back then inside of there. It's very interesting because if you look at the Dionysus cult and the Dionysus mysteries, it's very obvious So, from the texts, and from there's a certain historian that went around, an ancient Greek historian, and said that they would walk around they would drink, and then they would walk around with glazed eyes, looking at the stars and mumbling under the stars.
Yeah.
And these, they would get really drunk. And by the way, the whole reading of the stars, I think that the stars are kind of like this map for which we get to kind of project our subconscious onto them. And that's why somebody who's able to read the stars is able to see what's happening in the future, because they're so in touch with the subconscious contents that are happening inside of them, which get projected onto the stars, and they see, okay, this is what's happening next, right? Because they're in touch with the I'm sure you've thought about this, because it sounds like something that, And so, right, in the Dionysus cult, they're for sure mixing things inside of these drinks. They're also taking the vine, and they knew how to grow the vine. If you look at ayahuasca is also, and if you've tasted ayahuasca, it kind of tastes like wine also. And it's also taken from a root, and it's mixed with other, and it's for sure, like in Greek cultures and around the Mideast,
and around the ancient Near East is that they knew how to use herbs in order to induce certain states. In Judaism itself, on the holiest day of the year, on Yom Kippur, the high priest would put a double portion of the incense, would enter into the Holy of Holies, and then he would speak with God. It's like, okay, well, wonder what's going on there, like. So like they were obviously using certain in order to get in touch with it. In order to get in touch, they were using certain material or psychedelic. They were entering into psychedelic states, which can be entered into as well without psychedelics.
Actually, I mean,
okay, yeah, that was
but just to quickly touch on that last point. I mean, there's something I want to get back to. That last point, I mean, this is another one weird thing about me that I brought up, but like, again, like I experiment with my mind a lot. And one of the things I found was that, I don't know if this will work for everybody, but I find certain breathing exercises. I'm not sure there's a name for it because I did it randomly just as an experiment, and it caused ego death, which is where I just breathe heavily for a while and then hold my breath for a while. And that causes the ego to dissolve in a very powerful way, but it's very temporary. And so, but it one of the things what happens when your ego dissolves is
you do quick deep breathing.
Quick deep breathing for about, I mean, the longer you do it, I don't know how dangerous this is, but like I did it for about 2 minutes, and then I held my breath for about a minute. And what happened was my ego it completely vanished. It's so bizarre because, and like I was describing before, it's like the inrush of all the emotions. So one of the things the ego does is that it holds back your emotions. Because again, they're instinctual, and the ego is kind of anti-instinctual. But you feel the inrush of all these things you just didn't even think about, like the state of your life as it is presently, and like how your life has changed recently. That's probably just my own experiences. But again, that's a very. I'll probably make a video about that to like teach people how to do it and see if it also works for them, because it definitely works for me. But like I'm not sure if this is a widespread thing. But yeah, it definitely led to an ego death experience, very temporary. But again, like I said in my video on ego death, there are sort of different ranges of what ego death entails, because there can be very, very sort of big ego deaths where your ego completely dissolves, and it's not the result of psychedelics or something. It's a result of your life. For example, if you find out that like a loved one has betrayed you in some way, perhaps they cheated on you or something like that. That's an ego destroying experience, because the way you conceptualized the world previously has now been shattered. Exactly, right? But of course, there's other sort of contexts in which ego death can occur, and then the psychedelic one is when you literally don't have an ego. It's like you're kind of like you're one with the universe, because you're not an individual anymore. You're kind of like you kind of feel like you're everything. So again, there's like a different range of spectrums. The thing you were describing before, as we need to reconnect with nature, there is kind of an archetype. There is kind of the evolution of the God image, which encompasses this idea. And again, it's related to the archetype of the self, and the self does ultimately, because again, we're all familiar with this, that consciousness is an experience of dividing the masculine from the feminine. But then when we recede back and these two things become reconnected, we have the archetype of the self, which is the reunification of these sort of polarized elements. And I think, again, and I've seen this happen, that the image of God as we conceptualize him is no longer being seen as purely masculine, but rather the union of masculine and feminine. And so again, you begin to see God not just in civilization, even though the masculine element results in civilization, but you begin to see God in everything. You begin to see God, like you said, in a tree. A tree becomes the most beautiful thing that you begin to worship. And you don't see it as separate from God, or like as an element of the nature goddess.
You see it as a divine. You see it as actually representing the divine itself.
Yeah, exactly. As a component of the divine. It's no longer something different from the divine. It is. I think that's the kind of image that will inevitably, or at least, I think hopefully, begin to encapsulate our image of what the divine really is.
It better.
Yeah, for the sake of us all, right?
For the sake of us all, for sure.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just like it's always interesting, because it's so interesting how the transpersonal elements translate themselves into personal elements, which means like how these ideas, or the Platonian ideas, how we see them actually take form in reality, which is that we are, I apologize for the use of the word, but we are raping the earth. And you see it through the phallic instruments that we use in order to mine, to get oil, right? And also, and war in general is used through different phallic how do you shoot, and this technology that we use in order to kill and in order to conquer, in order to conquest, which is literally destroying the world. And this is, yeah, I mean, I don't know where I want to go with that, but yeah, we just a note to the viewers, if anybody watches this, is that, it's time. It is time. It is overtime. And but the thing is that, it's interesting. I put up a status on Facebook once, which is that it's so funny that it was the religious people that are always worried about apocalypse, and today it's the most secular people who are worried about apocalypse. I mean, really, religious people are also worried about it, but I'm talking more about on the environmental level.
Yeah,
and it's interesting that Neumann has a very interesting in the appendixes of the second part of the Origins of Jewish Consciousness. He says that the same terrors, the same things that terrify us, the external things that terrify us, which are planes flying overhead that threaten us, like warplanes, or he said that the same external things that terrify us today and threaten us today gives us a good idea of how we feel helpless in a certain sense towards the external world. And during COVID, it's just like, I feel totally helpless, against the things that are happening in the external world, is how man felt for most of history towards the contents of his subconscious, which was, in the symbols is hell, demons, and all the other, tentacle
about the monsters,
creatures which are going to pull monsters, which are coming to pull you back into the basement. And that was the very real threat. And it's hard to look at that today. But when people talked about apocalypse throughout the generations, they weren't talking about a physical apocalypse necessarily. Yeah, okay, there could be earthquakes, but nobody was like, okay, we have the ability of atomic bombs and earthquakes and natural disasters, which is going to wipe out the world. It was more like the subconscious element is going to take over because of the sins of man. And the sin, what's the worst thing you could do is give credence towards this, open up the floodgates of hell, which are the floodgates of subconscious, and have us all swallowed up inside of it. This was, and this is a big idea also in the dualism, which Jesus, which is the end of the day of judgment, which is the dualism, which shows up in the New Testament, which is that, I will return, and and inside of Christian art in general, which is that I will raise up those, and I will raise up those who are worthy, and those who are not will descend down into hell, and they will be swallowed up inside of the world of the subconscious. But today it's interesting that our existential threat to the world and to ourselves is not one necessarily of the subconscious anymore. It's not inner contents, it's external contents. It's the world literally being destroyed. And that is material world being destroyed, which is much more feminine. Like, it's what's in danger here is not the masculine principle being destroyed, it's the feminine principle being destroyed. And you can tell from what's in most danger is the thing that we need to be in touch with the most.
Yeah, that's
if that makes any
true.
sense.
No, that's definitely an apt description of like the current world that we live in. We're abusing the earth to such a degree that it's going to kill us because we are of the earth. Like, this is our home. Like, we destroy the earth, we destroy ourselves. But of course, that's not good for us. And so, if you want to coexist with nature, we do need to cool it with the masculine ambition and sort of return back to our instinctual roots, I guess, to an extent, but also recognize what we're doing. It's hard to before I became interested in all this psychology stuff, I was an avid environmentalist, and one of the reasons I kind of stopped being an environmentalist is because it felt completely hopeless. Like, it felt like we're producing way too much plastic, way too much garbage. There's no hope. We can't move past this. But now I realize, like, we have no choice, but also there's also part of me that believes that we can better the earth through our ambition. We can, for instance, make the deserts green again. It's a very ambitious goal, but it's something that's possible. I know that's always kind of a tangent, but that's just my thinking.
That's very interesting what you're saying. I mean, I also believe that there's mankind is always on, there wasn't like all of a sudden we're living in the times of the like mankind is always on the edge.
Mm-hmm.
The world is always about to be destroyed.
Yeah,
You know,
really.
whether that's our psyche or whether that's, I mean, that's what gives credence to apocalyptic, you know, people call apocalyptic people crazy, but it's very reasonable in a certain sense.
Yeah,
that
it's very
we have
reasonable.
very reasonable, and we can destroy the world, and the choice is ours. But I also think that, I mean, the hard thing for me with environmentalists is just like also like the heavy apocalyptic stuff going on inside the circles, and that there's and also I think that the individual, and this is what's so empowering about Neumann and Jung, is that Jung was urging people to understand that it's the individual's transformation which is what changes the world. And it's so hard for us to see it, especially in the Western world, where it's all about, can you get famous? It's all about politics, democracy. It's all about how is the way that you influence. It's by going out and getting an elected official to change the law, to change other people's, which is the exact opposite of going inside yourself and changing yourself.
No, because it's depending on somebody else. It's depending on like an external thing. You're no longer an individual. You're just kind of you're kind of sacrificing your individuality for the collective.
Right, Rilke has a beautiful quote inside of Notes to a Young Poet. Have you read it?
No.
I highly recommend. It's a great book. It's very short.
Okay.
And he says over there that once upon a time people thought that the sun revolves around the earth, and of course we figured out that was wrong, and that perhaps today, in the future, today we believe that our greatest influence on the world is us exerting ourselves externally on the world. And perhaps one day we will see that that was no more foolish than the earth, thinking that the earth revolves around the sun. And that really it's the changing of the individual. And this is the idea, and Neumann saw this as being the idea of the tzaddik, or the righteous person, or the / Messiah inside of Kabbalah and inside of this, inside of the Hasidic. I don't know how you say it in English, but Hasidut.
I've heard it as Hasidic,
which was Hasidic, the Hasidic principle of the righteous man, which is that the righteous man which is the hero, and this is what Jung was trying to tell people, which is that you have to, in order to save the world, you have to save your own world. And it's so potent for today, especially just because we're so obsessed. I mean, here in Israel, politics is just like people are obsessed with politics, which is that we got to change the society through politics. And Jung is saying, go the other way. And that really, that if you want to change, if you want to change the external, bad mouthing, immature baby that's in charge of your country, whoever that may be, you have to realize that he lives within you as well. And that when you change that inside of yourself, and if you're able to go through those changes and be in touch, with those contents within yourself and really change them, you bring that light into the world. It's just so hard for us to conceive of it, but this was very obvious. I think this was something that was more obvious to the ancients, that they understood that, that perhaps they didn't have as much a technological ability of how to actually engineer the external world, but they had great knowledge about about what's going on inside. And this is also their ability to do magic and things, which just from, I don't know where you stand on magic. I don't know if it's like people do it today or whatever else, but if it shows up in every single culture, and they talked about that they were magicians, and obviously that was something that they were able to do, that they were able to actually play with reality. That's a whole tangent within itself. But yeah, and I think that is something that we need to, especially in the Western world. And Peter Kingsley talks about this. He says that it's not enough for us to become obsessed with Eastern religions or, niche shamanic tribes inside of South America. We have to reclaim we have to go back to the roots of Western culture. We have to go back to our own roots, and we have to delve deep inside of there. And that also began, that began with inner experience. That began with inner mystical experience. We need to reclaim, to a certain aspect, tribalism. Which is very hard to do, especially in the universalistic and globalistic world of today, which is important because, there's not it's important because, you know, as a development of our ability to meet one another and to have these interactions, but not to turn it into just one big melting pot, you know, and for people to actually be able to be in touch with to be in culture with their roots. And you see so many people turning to it, whether it's in the shamanic cultures or whether it's the new age. People are really looking for it.
They're really
They really are.
craving it.
They're really craving it, and it's part of the post-masculine Christian, Judeo-Christian ethic. You could say Judeo-Christian, you could say the Christian ethic, and the Western world. I mean, because the Western world is a tolada, is a reaction. You know, it is an outcome of Christianity. At the end of the day, Christianity is the religion of the West, mostly. I mean, it always inculcates within it different pagan elements, depending on the
like Santa Claus.
Santa Claus.
That's a pagan image.
Oh yeah, I mean, well, also, I mean, Jesus sitting on Mary's lap. You could say that's like, if you just look in, you know, a different Egyptian. I mean, just in general, I mean, like the Christianity, because it was born from within a context of paganism, and it adopted certain of those elements as well, which I think is very healthy in a certain sense, because you need to be able to be in touch with those mystical kind of components. The Catholic Church did a very good job of staying in touch with it as well. From the very little that I know about it. But yeah, I mean, if people are listening, then it's delve back into your culture. You know, ask it, whether it's asking your parents or your grandparents, find out where they came from. What, you know, it's for most of us, you know, it's about our. I mean, for Jews especially, it's like, what were our grandparents doing? How did they believe in the world? You know, what, and if your grandparents, and if, you know, you go into your history and you don't find anything satisfactory there, that makes you feel that you're being in touch with something that is the beyond, or something that is beyond you, then look for it somewhere else. But you have to be in touch with it somehow. And I think that, like, a lot of this, you know, I think that the modern sciences have made us very sick, because it's all about knowing. It's all about I know. You know, and I can read history, and I can bring the library, and I can understand that all of history, you know, whether it's Marx saying that all of history is, you know, the try and seize the means of, is just like is class war. All of history is this, or postmodern says all of history is a power struggle. It's like, you know what all of history is? It's like we have to get out of the knowing stage, where we think that we know how things are working, and part of the instinctual stage, and being within the mystery of reality itself.
Yeah.
You know,
engaging with the mystery, like acknowledging the fact that we don't really know what this is, and like
we don't know what this is.
Yeah.
We don't know what this is. We don't. And being, and part of not knowing what this is, by the way, is also part of work with the body, because the body is, if you're very disconnected with your body, you don't know what your body wants things beyond you, because that's instinct, that's being, it's pure being. And because we've neutered that for a very, very long time, we're very sick because of it. And the society that we have today is the result of that sickness. And I think that what Jung was trying to get was, yeah, I've said it a few times already, but it's, you know, and yeah, for me lately, and that's interesting, because for me it's been, well, I left orthodoxy, and then recently I've come back to it because I'm able to put on my tefillin, which are these phylacteries in the morning, which I put one on the head and one on the arm, and I say certain words which start to describe about the heavenly host of angels, which are praising God. And I feel an uplifting there. I feel that it's incredible poetry, and just in general the worship of the beyond, of something that is way, way beyond you, which reality is. It is way, way beyond you. You don't understand. You don't know. And the ability, by the way, to say that we don't know is a delve back into the feminine in a certain sense, you know. And
yeah, definitely,
you can only do that if you have a, you know, if you just go around from the age 7 saying, well, we can't know anything. And yeah, well, we'll see how you turn out in 30 years. Not pretty.
Yeah.
But I mean, for me, it was, and that's part of the reason why I was so attracted to that's why Neumann and Jung opened up my eyes to be able to see that, you know, become conscious, become unconscious. and that there's not one that's more important than the other.
Yeah, it's a balancing act between the two.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, Shimmy, this was a amazing conversation.
Yeah, 3 hours, man. I'm starting to like. I'm starting to peter off a little bit in general.
Yeah.
And yeah, it could be the first of many.
Yeah, let's definitely do this again.
There's plenty more to discuss.
Yeah, I feel like we even though we discussed as much as we discussed, it somehow still just scratches the surface. Great. Okay, so thanks again so much for being on the channel. And
of course.
I hope the audience.
Yeah, thank you for reaching out, man. It would seem that there was definitely the Jungian alchemical reaction.
Yeah. Okay, awesome.